Now, live from Whitney Media, 1460 WVOX, the Greenburgh Report with Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner. You can join in the conversation at 914-636-0110. Now on 1460 WVOX, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenburgh Town Supervisor, and we have a really interesting program today. My guest is Peter Wolf, who's president of Nuclear Energy Solutions. Peter's been very involved in Hastings and the effort to close Indian Point. And right now, Indian Point is closing, but it's not all over. So, Peter, could you just tell us a little bit? I read, a while back, the governor said that Indian Point is going to close. Entergy is selling the property, and I felt a lot of relief, and said, good, we're all safe now. Does the closure of Indian Point mean that Indian Point is that we all are safe from a potential nuclear disaster?
Well, not entirely. Thank you for having me, Paul. I'd just like to give a little background that Indian Point Energy Center was created about 50 years ago, and there were 3 reactors. One closed in 1974. Indian Point 2 closed last year on April 30th, and Indian Point 3 will now close on April 30th of this year. And it will certainly diminish the possibilities of having a fire from a reactor, because the reactor will actually be shut down on April 30th. But it just really augurs in a new era, and one that has its own concerns, Paul. So I can relate a little bit more. Indian Point is closing probably more because Entergy wanted to close it for economic reasons, because at this point in time, Indian Point cannot compete with the price of natural gas. But what will happen when they actually shut down is that the reactors will close down, and then the fuel that's in the reactors will go into fuel pools. And at the time that the fuel pools are complete and the fuel is unloaded, then what is slated to happen is that Entergy will transfer its license, its U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission license, to a company called Holtec. And, could you just tell us again the timetable in terms of the 2 Indian Point reactors? Where are we at this exact moment? Okay, just to review, Indian Point, there were 3 reactors at Indian Point Energy Center. The first reactor was closed in 1974 because of operational difficulties. And for most of the last few decades, the Hudson Valley has had Indian Point 2 and Indian Point 3 operating in Buchanan, New York, which is in the northwest corner of Westchester County. In an agreement in 2017, there were 3 parties, the state of New York, the Riverkeeper, and Entergy, and they agreed to have closure of Indian Point 2 last April, which closed on April 30th, 2020. And Indian Point 3 is scheduled to close at the end of this month, which would be April 30th, 2021.
Right. And for our listeners who don't know what a fuel pool is, would you be able to explain exactly what a fuel pool is and why this is important?
Well, the fuel pools are important because what has to happen is that the rods, which contain the fuel and are radioactive, they need to cool down. And they need to be in fuel pools for essentially years. There's some question whether it's normally it's about 5 years. There is something called high burn-up fuel, and many people think that should be there for a longer period. But actually, Holtec, who is the licensee, the purported licensee, says that it could be fuel pool. The rods could be taken out in as soon as 2.5 2.5 years. And what happens once the rods are taken out is that they're put onto dry cast storage, and it remains on the site. So in these huge canisters, which hold the fuel rods, and these are essentially air-cooled, and they just sit outside, and they're cooled.
Oh, we have to take a break, and this is a 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back with Peter Wolf, who is president of Nuclear Energy Solutions. So stay tuned.
Now, back to the Greenburgh Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, I'm Paul Feiner, and I'm the Greenburgh Town Supervisor. And my guest is Peter Wolf, President of Nuclear Energy Solutions. And Peter, could you tell us maybe a little bit about what you do as President of Nuclear Energy Solutions?
Yeah, well, we are basically a consulting firm. We do research. We also represent different interests, and also what we can do is to act as a liaison between different types of groups, because as you probably know, there are pro-industry groups and industry itself, and there are also activist organizations in the community. But one of the primary things that we do is we have Nuclear Energy TV, which is actually an Internet TV channel that's free to the viewer. Anybody can go on to it by just typing in www.nuclearenergytv.com, and they can see a wide variety of programming. And with respect to Indian Point, Paul, Nuclear Energy TV actually went down to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission headquarters in Rockville, Maryland, and we videotaped the entire application by Entergy to transfer their license to Holtec. We also have many other types of programming relating to Indian Point, including an interview of me in December. We also have on an interview with the Riverkeeper's legal director, Richard Webster. We also have on a program that Clearwater did for an entire afternoon, and there are many other interviews about Indian Point on nuclearenergytv.com. So,
the other question I have is, Cortland and they're going to be getting a big hit because of the closure of Indian Point in terms of taxes, and what's happening to them, what's happening to the workers, and also what's going to happen with our utility bills now that Indian Point is closing. Do you anticipate that our Con Ed bills are going to go up a lot? And what can be done to stop that?
It's a lot of questions, Paul. Let me see what I can do one at a time.
I have run-on sentences, right?
No, it's fine. So first of all, there's no question that the community around Indian Point, which includes Buchanan and the town of Cortland, are going to take a big hit over time. It is not only the question of the people who are actually employed there, but also there are a lot of services that are in these communities that cater to the workers, and they're also going to be impacted. And there's a tremendous loss to the Hendrick Hudson School District, because I think approximately 40% of their budget was funded by what we call pilots, and pilots stand for payment in lieu of taxes, that was being paid by Entergy. So yes, there's a great impact there. With regard to the energy and the price of Con Ed, from everything that I've seen, I do not expect to have that will be an item of a big impact. What you have is you have the grid, which is supplying the energy, and actually there was sort of a myth that Indian Point was supplying a lot of the energy to the Hudson Valley in New York City, but that actually wasn't so. Indian Point was producing 25% of the amount of energy that they were producing came to 25% of what is consumed in the state of New York, but actually they were selling it to a number of different utilities, and as a matter of fact, it was normally about 6% that was going into Con Ed, and in recent years, it's gone down to 0. And the prediction by the state regulators and also by the people who run the grid is that it will have a negligible impact. And as a matter of fact, that's sort of verified by the fact that during one of the hottest summers of all, one of the Indian Point plants was out the entire summer. Nobody noticed the difference. So I don't think there'll be a major impact there.
That is good. A lot of people want to know what happens to Entergy's U.S. NRC license.
Well, that is a point actually of substantial controversy because Entergy entered into this contract to sell it to Holtec, but Holtec is a company that A, is privately owned, and B, they do not have a lot of experience in decommissioning nuclear power plants. And C, there's a huge question about how the decommissioning fund is going to be spent. And the decommissioning fund was created actually by ratepayers for the time when the facility was going to be shut down. So there are various estimates about the amount of money that is in the decommissioning fund. It's something between $2.1 and $2.3 billion. The initial estimate for cleanup is $2.4 billion. However, that is before they do a site characterization, which means they actually go in and see what needs to be done. And, of course, initially, Entergy wanted to do this over a 7.5-year period. They now say it's going to be a 15-year period. So likely this is going to go substantially up. In addition to that, Entergy has applied to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for an exemption for nuclear waste management. This is not that unusual, but what normally happens is that the Department of Energy reimburses the utility for the spent fuel management, but Holtec has not agreed to put the reimbursed funds back into the decommissioning fund. So the decommissioning fund could go down to, say, $1.5 or $1.6 billion, and the cost of cleanup could go to $2.7 or $3 or even higher billion dollars. So there could be a substantial shortfall. And this has caused a great deal of consternation in various quarters. And the New York Attorney General has brought suit. And right now it's sitting in front of the New York Public Service Commission, which has not yet approved this. And also parties like the Riverkeeper and Cortland and Buchanan have filed suit to at least have a public hearing, which thus far has been denied, even though Senators Schumer, Gillibrand, and the 3 local representatives...
We have to take another break, I'm sorry, and we'll be back in about 3 minutes. I'm Paul Feiner, Greenburgh Town Supervisor.
WVOX. Now back to the Greenburgh Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, this is Paul Feiner. and this is one of the most interesting programs I've had over the years because Indian Point, the closure of Indian Point is impacting all of us, and it's an important issue. For many years, many people suggested that Indian Point closed down, and we really have to make sure that it's done correctly. That gets me to the next question. There's a company called Holtec, and I'm sort of wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what Holtec is.
Well, Holtec is well known in the nuclear field for cast and canister manufacturing, and they've done that and supplied these dry casks for a number of years. The dry casks themselves are of a thin wall construction. There are certain people who believe that they should be, for a place like Indian Point, they should be of a thicker construction, such as they do in Germany. But right now it's the type of canister that they have, and that's what they specialized in. And it seems that they're now trying to get into other areas of the nuclear industry. Among them, they're trying to develop a small advanced modular reactor called the SMR-160. They're also trying to establish what's called an interim storage facility for nuclear waste in New Mexico. And they have been trying to do decommissioning. They've started in decommissioning. They bought Oyster Creek, which is in New Jersey, and they've started decommissioning there. They've also bought Pilgrim in Massachusetts. They've started decommissioning there. They bought Indian Point, and they're under contract, I believe, to buy a plant called Palisade in Michigan. And what they're trying to do is something called the fleet approach, where they send in different teams to do different functions in a serial manner, and they claim that that's going to be a much more efficient way to decommission a plant. However, Holtec does not have a record of ever completing a decommissioning. They've just started this a couple of years ago, and so there are people in the Oyster Creek community in the middle of New Jersey, and there are people around Pilgrim who are not thrilled with the way that this is going, and they don't feel that Holtec is necessarily interfacing with the community, which is a big issue here. On Holtec's side, what they're arguing is that if they didn't come in to do the decommissioning, then the plant would just sit by idly, and the workers that are going to be hired by them, which they claim is going to be about 300, would be unemployed, so that there would be even more unemployment at Indian Point. They also claim that it's to the local community's benefit to have this done quickly so that the site can be returned to public use. So what has gone on now is that there are, as I say, there were lawsuits that were brought against the transfer, and there are also lawsuits being brought about these issues that I mentioned before, especially with regard to transparency with the financial arrangements and the technical competency. And I can tell you that, from talking to people, there are ongoing negotiations. As we're talking, there are ongoing negotiations in front of the New York State Public Service Commission, because at the end of the day in Massachusetts, the Attorney General had to sue Holtec, and finally they came to some type of an arrangement. And so they're trying to, I think, come to an arrangement that would place certain conditions on Holtec, but all of this is still speculation. I'm sort of wondering why Holtec, wants to deal with, this. It's going to be very controversial, and I know, as you mentioned before, that a lot of people, don't have really a lot of confidence in that company. Well, I think Holtec wants to do that because, first of all, the prize plum, of course, is the $2 billion decommissioning fund, and they're looking at that. Each nuclear reactor has a decommissioning fund, but I think more than that, Paul, they really want to get into a vertical type of integration so that they can make money doing the decommissioning. They can also make money on the storage because they're also going to make money on their own canisters. And if their facility goes through in New Mexico, they're probably going to want to transport it and be able to store the nuclear waste indefinitely in New Mexico and make even more money. And so that's one aspect of it, I believe. A second aspect of it is that you're going to have a facility here that plugs into the grid, and the question is even whether they're going to try to take their advanced reactors and put them on site and distribute energy through the advanced reactors and use the grid. So there are a number of speculative factors here, but Holtec, I think, wants to do a vertical integration, and this is just part of a much larger plan that they have.
That's so interesting. Could you tell us a little bit about what the decommissioning is and what the process is?
Yes, decommissioning is basically it's a dismantling and demolition of the facility, but of course it is really complicated because it involves a lot of radioactive materials. And so what happens is that these materials have to be dealt with in a responsible manner, and that is a big issue. What happens is that during decommissioning, it has its own dangers to it, especially in a place like Indian Point. So, for example, you still have that natural gas pipeline that's so close to Indian Point. I think it's something like 105 feet away, so that you have all different types of potential dangers. And, of course, the other thing is that you don't want this radioactive material to end up in the Hudson River. So this has to be done with a great deal of technical competence. Now what Holtec is trying to do is to have a company which they have partnered with, a company called Lavalin in Canada. And Lavalin supposedly has a lot more experience in the nuclear decommissioning area. But Lavalin recently has had its own legal problems in Canada, and they've been barred by the World Bank for 10 years, and there was a scandal in Canada about some of their activities. So,
right,
maybe on the financial front, by the way.
Right. In terms of the NRC, if they're not active. What about New York State, Westchester, and Greenburgh?
Well, let's talk about the NRC first. I mean, it really is kind of incredulous that they would not hold a public hearing about the transfer of the license. And this is especially so because, as I mentioned before, the New York congressional delegation requested a hearing beforehand, and then they gave provisional approval for the license transfer, and then after that they said there would be no public hearing. So the state of New York has become very, very active in this. In the initial proceeding, there was a intervention by the New York State Attorney General and by Riverkeeper and by the local municipalities of Buchanan and Cortland. And as far as I know, a lot of this legal action is still pending. It has not been completely decided. And as I said, I have it on authority, which, they cannot say anything about the substance, but there are ongoing negotiations. The issue with Westchester County really is that they're going to have to provide a lot more of the emergency response, because part of what happens is that the NRC grants the licensee the ability to downscale both emergency response and security at the plant, claiming that the plant is no longer in operation. But as I mentioned, there are ongoing decommissioning activities, and also there's the whole question of nuclear waste management. So Westchester County has to be very concerned about emergency response. And, the town of Greenburgh, I mean, all of us, can be impacted. There are 20 million people that live within a 50-mile radius of Indian Point. And clearly, the dangers of an explosion or something of that nature are very much diminished when the plant closes. But there's still ongoing dangers, and the whole question of radiation needs to be explored. And also, I think there's an element of going forward. I think that they need to be compelled to use the best available technologies to protect the site, because there can be bad actors either from abroad or even from the United States that may want to cause a major disruption and cause a tremendous amount of damage. And I think that what they need to be able to do at Indian Point is to create a very safe environment for the storage of the nuclear waste. And I think that has to include things like sensors and artificial intelligence and protection against new forms of technology like drones. So I think that there is a lot that needs to be done on the local level to protect the citizens that are within the vicinity of Indian Point.
Right. I know before Indian Point closed down, I was very involved in IPSEC and groups that were trying very hard to close down Indian Point. I know that Richard Brodsky, who passed away about a year ago and was the assemblyman, he was a leader in the effort to close down Indian Point. Is there like a citizen group that is working on this issue right now, and what could they be doing?
Well, there are lots of citizens groups that are involved. As I said, Riverkeeper, who was a party to the initial agreement between New York State and Entergy, is very much involved. I spoke with them actually this morning about the actions that they're taking. Also, Clearwater has had programs about this, which involves Pete Harcum and Sandy Galiff, who are the New York State Senator and an assembly person in that area. So that's very good. And they just had a congressional briefing last week at EESI concerning issues.
We have to take another break now, and we'll be right back. And I'm Paul Feiner, Greenburgh supervisor.
Now, back to the Greenburgh Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Good morning. I'm Paul Feiner, and my guest is Peter Wolf, who's president of Nuclear Energy Solutions. And I should mention we're so fortunate to have somebody in our community who knows so much about this important field, because the closing of Indian Point is really an issue that is of great importance to everyone in Westchester, County, and it's a very, very complicated, issue. Peter, what would happen if Holtec would run out of the money before the decommissioning is completed?
Well, that's the big question, Paul, and I think that that's what's being decided now. The NRC wants to say, or does say, that they annually review what happens, but of course, very often the fox is already out of the chicken coop at that point. So it's a big issue, and I think that that's one of the points that needs to be negotiated with the New York Public Service Commission, so that it ends up that New York State or the ratepayers don't end up holding the bag, while Holtec has taken out a lot of the money, like, let's say, for nuclear waste management, that it doesn't put back, which really is, in a way, it can be looked as an unjust enrichment, where, and it's particularly difficult to trace because Holtec is a privately held company, so they don't have to file reports with the SEC and so forth. So it really is a very substantial issue, I think.
The location of Indian Point is really spectacular. The views are amazing of the Hudson. And now that Indian Point has is closing down, do you think this beautiful site could ever be used again? I mean, could it be a park? Could it be housing? Could it be mixed-use development? Or are we going to have to wait a couple thousand years?
Well, I think the site can be reused. I think that, it certainly can be a park. It certainly should be turned back over to public use because it is a beautiful place. So somehow the area which is called an IFC, which is where the nuclear waste is stored, that could be cordoned off. There are ongoing studies now about whether there can be, radiation emitted from these plants, and if so, how far and how much, and so forth. And that needs to be taken into consideration, but it certainly could be brought in. It's a whole other question whether you could put housing on there. I think it could be a park. I think it could be used for other purposes, but I don't know whether it could really be used for housing until further studies.
In terms of a park, why would say a park be okay? People are on the site, and housing not be okay.
Because people who go to a park could be there for maybe 1 or 2 or 5 or even 10 hours per month, which is a lot different than being there for 10 or 12 or 14 hours per day. So it depends on what the radiological emissions are nearby and how closely that can be ascertained. But that's why I'm saying that, because, people are exposed to radiation all the time. The famous thing is chest X-ray, but, it's many times worse to even fly in a plane to Europe or someplace because you get exposed. So people get exposed to radiation, but what is exactly a safe level remains to be seen, and also some people maintain there is no safe level, by the way. But, and there has to be a measurement taken as to the radiation and how far away the storage facility is before this can be undertaken.
Right. So, what about, I remember years ago when they were talking about the spent fuels that they were going to be moved to, like Arizona or, another...
that's what they're talking about. That was Yucca Mountain in Nevada, and that has yet to be approved, and there's no other facility to be approved. But, I've been talking to somebody extremely knowledgeable, and they said that the real difficulty is that nuclear waste is a problem but not a crisis. So, it needs to be dealt with, but it is, to some degree at least, manageable. I wanted to point out one thing before we conclude, because we've been focusing on Indian Point, but I think it's very, very important that listeners understand that as people are going for a carbon-free or carbonless or decarbonized economy, that nuclear still provides over 50% of the non-fossil fuel energy throughout the country, and it's a higher percentage in New York. And the 3 reactors upstate are still functioning and will for at least until 2030. And that nuclear energy has all kinds of new potential. So I want to, on the one hand, I think it's extremely important that we talk about Indian Point because it's closing and it's right in our backyard. But I think also it's important to have a perspective that nuclear is likely to be part of the mix with renewables as we go forward.
Exactly. Are there other nuclear power plants in New York State, and are they closing?
There are 3 upstate New York, and none of them are closing. They're part of Governor Cuomo's plan to have a carbon-free environment by 2030. And I think what needs to be understood is that there's so much going on in the field. There are small modular reactors which could be used, which could be much more efficient. There are advanced nuclear reactors being built. There's also a lot of activity in the area of fusion, because these nuclear plants are done by fission, and as well as hydrogen. But also, there are even people who believe that nuclear energy needs to be used because it's such a tremendous power source that's so reliable, it's 24/7. And there's some people that are saying that everybody's talking about reducing the rate of increase of putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and greenhouse gases, but that nuclear actually has the potential to be able to take all these greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, and that that might be a way to really deal with climate change. So I just wanted to give a little bit more balanced approach to this, because I think it's important to understand that nuclear probably will have a role going forward, and an important role, especially since, as people love to say, solar's great when the sun shines and wind is great when the wind blows, but nuclear is something that can be produced 24/7 on a very reliable basis. So, I think that needs to be brought out as a counterbalance to the very, very serious issues that still remain at Indian Point.
If people want to get more information, what can they do?
Well, they can certainly go to our channel, Nuclear Energy TV, which again is www.nuclearenergytv.com. But I would also suggest that they go to areas, like the New York State Public Service Commission. They can see what the Attorney General is doing. Also, Riverkeeper has sites. Clearwater does. By the way, there are other areas, and you pointed them out, and with IPSEC, and the Sierra Club is also having a strong input. And I think there's programs coming up actually on April 30th. I think Riverkeeper is going to have one from 6 to 7:30, and I think Sierra Club is going to have one from 7:30 to 9. So there are other areas where people can get additional information.
That is great. We only have about another minute, and is there anything else you'd like to mention?
Well, as I say, I think people need to be keenly aware of what goes on at Indian Point, both from the financial aspect, from the technical aspect, but also from the safety aspect. I think that people need to know that the federal government, the state government, and the local government are going to be vigilant in protecting people's interests there, which, as I say, deal from physical, the radiological ones, as well as the financial ones. And I would hope that people will remain aware and involved as this process continues, because it's going to go on for at least 15 more years.
Great. Well, I really want to thank you for joining us. Do you think that in the future there should be more nuclear power plants? Because I guess some people feel nuclear is cleaner and there's pluses, or you think are you not a fan of more nuclear plants?
I am. I do believe that the technological advances in nuclear are very worthwhile. I think as we look from now to 2050, I think that nuclear should have a very strong role, and I think in the future that nuclear can be used to modulate the renewables. Number one has to be energy efficiency. That has to be the first thing that we look at. The second thing you can look at are renewables, because if you can get them going, obviously, that could be very important and cost-effective. But I think nuclear needs to be part of this mix. I think that nuclear needs to be the factor that supplies stability and provides possible impetus to new energy sources. And because nuclear is used in space travel, nuclear is used in medicine, nuclear is used in many other aspects. So I do think that nuclear should be a strong part of the future going forward.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.